He kicked an Apache widow for fun, but her revenge made the West whisper her name in fear. He began as a shadow at the edge of town, someone people noticed only when they needed a reminder of how unfair the world could be. The frontier settlement stood where dusty roads crossed between wide plains and rising hills, a place where travelers arrived tired and left quickly. Most people came here to build something new, yet old habits and old fears followed them. Among these people lived a woman who carried quiet strength in her posture. She was known simply as the Apache Widow, a name spoken more as a label than a greeting. She lived in a small cabin beyond the main street, close enough to hear the noise of wagons but far enough to avoid the crowds. Each morning she woke before sunrise, lighting a small fire and preparing her tools. She worked steadily, gathering herbs, repairing clothing, and sometimes trading handmade items for supplies. Her movements were calm, precise, and patient. Many avoided speaking to her, but they watched her from a distance, curious and uncertain. The town itself moved with restless energy. Horses stamped the ground outside saloons, merchants called out prices, and dust hung in the air like a curtain that never lifted. Children ran between buildings, and travelers stopped at the well to refill canteens before continuing west. Life here depended on cooperation, yet suspicion lingered beneath every conversation. On a warm afternoon, when the sky turned pale gold and heat shimmered over the ground, the widow walked into town carrying a basket. She needed flour, salt, and a few simple tools. She kept her eyes forward, moving with quiet confidence. Some people nodded politely, while others turned away. She had grown used to this mixture of respect and distance. At the center of town stood a group of young men laughing loudly. Among them was the son of a powerful rancher, a man whose wealth gave him influence despite his youth. He dressed well, wore confidence like armor, and enjoyed the attention of his companions. Many tolerated him because of his family name. Even when his behavior crossed lines others would never dare approach. When he noticed the widow, his expression changed. Instead of indifference, he saw an opportunity to entertain his friends. He stepped forward, blocking her path with exaggerated confidence. The laughter behind him grew louder, encouraging him. The widow paused, her face calm, waiting for him to move aside. He made a cruel joke meant to provoke a reaction. The words drew uncomfortable glances from nearby townspeople, yet no one intervened. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched silently, unsure whether stepping in would bring trouble. The widow attempted to walk past him, but he pushed her shoulder roughly, causing her basket to fall and scatter its contents into the dust. Flour bags burst slightly, and small tools rolled across the ground. A few people gasped quietly, yet the sound disappeared beneath the laughter of the young man. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The widow knelt to gather her belongings without speaking. Her movements remained steady, almost peaceful, as if she refused to give the scene more power than it deserved. The rancher's son laughed again, expecting anger or tears, but she offered neither. Her silence unsettled him more than any response might have. An older shopkeeper watched from his doorway, his face lined with concern. He considered stepping forward but hesitated, caught between conscience and fear of conflict. The widow finished collecting her things, stood slowly, and met the young man's eyes. There was no hatred in her gaze, only quiet understanding. She walked away without another word. The laughter behind her faded as people returned to their business, yet the air felt heavier than before. Some townspeople whispered to each other, wondering whether they should have acted differently. Others convinced themselves that it was not their responsibility. Back in her cabin, the widow placed her basket on a table and sat quietly. Outside, the wind moved through dry grass, carrying distant sounds of the town. She closed her eyes and remembered lessons from her past. Lessons about patience, about choosing the right moment, and about strength that did not rely on noise or force. She did not rush into action. Instead, she began observing more closely. Over the following days, she visited the market at different times, listening carefully to conversations around her. She learned who traded with whom, which ranches struggled with supplies, and which travelers carried news from neighboring towns. The rancher's son continued his usual behavior, moving through town with careless confidence. He assumed the incident had no consequences, Yet small changes began forming beneath the surface. A woman who had witnessed the scene started greeting the widow more warmly. But trader offered her a fairer price than before. An older man shared information about incoming shipments. The widow accepted these gestures without drawing attention to them. She remained quiet, allowing trust to grow naturally. Each interaction added another thread to an invisible network of support. She helped a traveler repair a torn saddlebag, guided a lost child back to her parents, and shared food with a family passing through during hard times. Gradually, stories about her kindness began spreading. They were small stories, told quietly, but they changed how people viewed her. Instead of seeing only an outsider, some began recognizing her as someone reliable and wise. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat outside her cabin, watching the sky turn deep orange. The memory of the humiliation remained, but it no longer felt like a wound. It had become a lesson, a turning point that pushed her toward a new path. In town, conversations shifted subtly. A few people criticized the rancher's son in private, questioning whether his actions reflected poorly on his family. Others worried that his reckless behavior might bring trouble to the settlement. The widow continued preparing quietly. She repaired her tools, organized supplies, and practiced skills that required patience and precision. She studied the land around her cabin, noting paths, water sources, and hidden routes known only to those who paid attention. One morning, a traveling merchant arrived with news of changes in nearby towns. Trade routes were shifting, and certain goods would soon become scarce. The widow listened carefully, recognizing opportunity where others saw only difficulty. She began gathering items that would soon hold greater value, trading fairly and respectfully with anyone willing to deal with her. Meanwhile, the rancher's son faced small setbacks he did not understand. A trader refused to extend credit. A worker left his employment after being treated poorly. These events seemed unrelated, yet they formed the beginning of a slow transformation. The widow never spoke of revenge. Instead, she focused on building something stronger than anger. She understood that true power came from respect earned over time. Each day she moved forward with calm determination, knowing that patience could change the course of events more effectively than impulsive reactions.
As weeks passed, more people began acknowledging her presence with genuine respect.
Some asked for advice, others for assistance. She responded with fairness, never seeking recognition, allowing her reputation to grow naturally. One afternoon, as she walked through town again, the same street that once witnessed her humiliation felt different. Conversations paused briefly as people greeted her. The dust still rose under her steps, but the weight of silence had lifted. The rancher's son noticed this change, but did not fully understand it. He saw only small signs, a nod from a merchant, a polite smile from a passerby, yet he sensed that something had shifted. The widow continued forward, calm and steady, carrying within her a quiet strength that no one could easily challenge. The first chapter of her transformation unfolded not through loud confrontation, but through patience, resilience, and a decision to rise above cruelty without losing dignity. After the humiliation in the town square, the Apache widow returned to her small cabin, her mind quiet but alert. The dust from the streets clung to her boots, yet she did not let it weigh her down. Instead, she began to think carefully, realizing that immediate anger would not help her. She remembered the lessons her husband had taught her long ago, lessons of patience, awareness, and strategy. Strength was not always measured by who could yell the loudest or strike the hardest. True strength often came from thinking ahead, observing closely, and acting when the moment was right. The days that followed were filled with careful observation. She returned to town, carrying only small baskets of goods to trade, always keeping her head high, always calm. She watched the movements of the people she once thought indifferent, noticing who spoke to whom, who listened, and who ignored the young rancher's son. She paid attention to how the merchants organized their goods, which travelers stopped at the well, and which families struggled during the harsh sun. Every detail was a thread she could use to weave her plan, not of revenge through violence, but of influence through intelligence and respect. The widow began speaking to a few people quietly, offering small acts of help. She repaired a torn bag for a traveler who had lost a wheel, guided a lost child through the dusty streets back to their family, and shared a few portions of food with a family struggling under the weight of the sun. These were small acts, unnoticed by most, but they began to sow seeds of respect. People noticed her kindness in whispers. The older shopkeeper who had hesitated before now nodded at her when she passed. A young merchant began offering her better prices. Slowly, the widow began creating allies without drawing attention. Meanwhile, the rancher's son continued his reckless ways, confident that wealth could shield him from consequences. He boasted loudly to his friends, mocked travelers, and teased anyone he found different. His arrogance made people avoid him in public, but privately, some began to question his behavior. They wondered if his attitude might bring trouble to the town, especially as resources grew scarce during the heat of the season. The widow observed all of this quietly, never drawing attention to her awareness. She understood that patience and timing would be her greatest tools. One morning as she walked to town, she overheard two traders arguing. The rancher's son had failed to pay a promised debt, leaving them frustrated. She offered advice quietly to one of the traders on how to manage the situation without losing too much, careful to remain neutral yet helpful. The trader accepted her words and acted, not knowing that her guidance was already beginning to shift the balance of respect in her favor. The widow realized that knowledge and calm judgment could become far stronger weapons than anger or force. As the weeks passed, she continued to build quiet influence. She studied the land around her cabin, noting hidden paths, water sources, and safe places for travelers during storms. She became known to some wandering settlers as a reliable guide and helper. Stories of her wisdom and helpfulness began spreading quietly from one traveler to another. Even the town's children whispered her name with curiosity, and the parents began to nod in approval when they saw her helping those in need. The rancher's son noticed the change, though he could not understand it. He saw small signs, merchants nodding when he passed, travelers looking toward her for guidance, and a few people refusing to laugh at his jokes. It made him uneasy, though he tried to hide it behind a smile and boastful words. He continued with his usual arrogance, unaware that each careless act was slowly eroding the control he thought he had. One afternoon, a family arrived in town, exhausted and carrying very little. They had traveled for days under the harsh sun, their wagon wheels broken, their food running out. The widow approached them quietly and offered guidance and assistance. She helped repair the wagon, directed them to fresh water, and shared some food she had prepared earlier. She did not announce her help, nor did she seek recognition. Yet word traveled quickly through the town about the woman who aided travelers without asking for anything in return. By now, people began paying more attention. Small acts of kindness and quiet intelligence had shifted the town's perception of her. She was no longer just the widow at the edge of town. She was someone people looked to for guidance, even if they did not speak to her directly. Her calm and fair actions had earned her a reputation for wisdom, patience, and reliability. The rancher's son grew restless. He tried to provoke her again in the streets, mocking her quietly, attempting to assert his usual dominance. But the townspeople, now aware of her reputation, no longer stayed silent. Several witnesses stepped forward, quietly but firmly defending her. The young man's laughter faltered as he realized the town no longer viewed her as weak. Small whispers spread among the onlookers about her courage and wisdom. The widow, for her part, remained calm. She did not engage in argument or strike back. Instead, she allowed the shift in perception to take hold. By letting her reputation grow naturally, she created a power stronger than any immediate confrontation could achieve. People began trusting her judgment, respecting her decisions, and observing her actions carefully. Meanwhile, she also began learning about the struggles of the town. The drought had caused shortages of food and water, and tensions were high. Families argued over resources, merchants struggled to maintain trade, and travelers grew desperate. The widow saw an opportunity to help without seeking credit. She shared her knowledge of hidden water sources, offered advice on rationing supplies, and helped organize small aid for struggling families. Through these efforts, she became a quiet leader. She did not demand respect. Instead, she earned it through actions that benefited many. People started talking to her for advice. Travelers came to her for guidance, and even those who had ignored her before began noticing her presence. Her influence grew not from force, but from patience, intelligence, and reliability. The rancher's son, frustrated by his diminishing influence, acted rashly. He made decisions without thinking, overextended his resources, and angered some traders who once supported him. The widow watched carefully from a distance, noting his mistakes and how they affected the town. She understood that the moment for a larger change was approaching, but she waited. She knew that timing was everything. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she sat outside her cabin. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and dust. She reflected on the changes she had begun to see. The town no longer treated her as weak. Travelers and settlers relied on her guidance, and even the rancher's son began to falter. Her patience and careful planning were paying off. She also recognized that true influence required more than kindness. It required awareness, wisdom, and the ability to act decisively when the right moment came. She prepared herself mentally and physically for the challenges ahead. Her days were now filled with work, observation, and small acts of guidance. Every encounter, every small action, was part of a larger plan. The widow also began forming alliances quietly. A few older residents who had once respected her husband offered subtle support. Traders shared information about upcoming shipments and routes. Families she had helped recommended her to others. Slowly but surely, she was creating a network that could withstand the arrogance of the rancher's son and any other threats. By the end of this part, she had transformed significantly. The humiliation that had once burned within her was no longer a source of anger. It had become the spark that ignited her patience, intelligence, and strategy. She was no longer just the widow at the edge of town. She was becoming a figure of quiet strength, someone whose name was beginning to carry weight, even if people only whispered it. The town continued its busy life, unaware that the balance of respect was slowly shifting. Travelers came and went, merchants traded goods, and the rancher's son continued his reckless ways. Yet the seeds the widow had planted were growing. Her influence would continue to expand, and those who had once ignored or mocked her would soon understand the power of patience, intelligence, and quiet resilience. As the stars began to appear in the wide western sky, she looked toward the horizon. The road ahead was still long and challenges remained. But she was ready. She had learned that true strength was not about immediate revenge. It was about strategy, calmness, and the ability to shape the world around her without giving in to cruelty. The Apache widow had begun to rise, not through noise or confrontation, but through patience, wisdom, and quiet courage. Her story was just beginning, and the town had no idea how deeply her influence would reach. Every day, every small act, brought her closer to the moment when she would no longer be underestimated, and when her name would carry weight across the frontier. The widow's presence in the town had grown stronger with each passing week. Her quiet acts of kindness and sharp observation had begun to ripple through the settlement, shaping the opinions of those who had once ignored her. Travelers now sought her advice before venturing into the surrounding hills. Merchants consulted her judgment on fair trades, and even some of the town's elders who had been skeptical began to nod when she spoke. She had transformed from an overlooked figure into someone whose guidance mattered, even if most people did not yet fully understand her influence. Meanwhile, the rancher's son continued with his usual recklessness. He moved through town with loud confidence, mocking those he considered weaker and flaunting the advantages of his family's wealth. But the world was changing around him, and he did not notice. Traders refused to extend favors without payment. Workers he relied on began to leave quietly. Friends laughed less at his jokes and questioned his decisions in private. The widow, watching from the edges, recognized that his arrogance was slowly leading him toward his own downfall. She needed only to remain patient, letting the natural consequences of his choices unfold. One morning, the widow noticed a group of families struggling near the well. Water was scarce that day, and tempers had grown short. Arguments had broken out, and some travelers were threatening to leave without taking any water at all. The widow stepped forward quietly, offering help and guidance. She organized the line calmly, directing the flow of water so that each family could take what it needed without conflict. She spoke softly, with authority not from force but from fairness. People followed her instructions, and within moments, the tension dissolved. Her actions did not go unnoticed. A few townspeople who had once been indifferent now whispered her name among themselves with a sense of respect. Travelers told their stories to merchants who passed the word along. Her reputation continued to grow, but the widow never sought praise. She understood that influence gained quietly and fairly was far stronger than any attention demanded through confrontation. The rancher's son, observing from across the street, felt a subtle shift in the energy of the town. People no longer reacted to him as they once had. When he attempted to mock the widow in a crowded market, a few witnesses firmly defended her. Even some of his own friends hesitated, unsure whether joining in would make them appear foolish. For the first time he felt the unease that came from losing control, though he did not yet understand the depth of it. The widow, however, did not confront him directly. She continued building her network of allies, quietly supporting those who were struggling. She taught a young boy how to track game without harming it, showing him the value of patience. She guided a merchant in repairing a wagon wheel that had broken during the journey, ensuring that the traveler could continue safely. Each action strengthened her reputation and demonstrated the wisdom that the town had begun to recognize. Her influence extended beyond the town itself. Travelers returning from distant settlements carried stories of her calm judgment and helpfulness. They spoke of a woman who could solve problems without raising her voice, who treated everyone fairly, and whose quiet strength had begun to shape the community. The whispers spread across the frontier, drawing the attention of other settlements and travelers passing through. The rancher's son became increasingly frustrated. He tried to assert himself through wealth and force, offering rewards for favors and issuing threats to those who ignored him. Yet each attempt only revealed his impatience and lack of understanding. The widow, observing carefully, knew that the right moment to act was approaching. She did not need to provoke him. The natural consequences of his arrogance were already unfolding. One afternoon, a serious drought worsened the situation in the town. Families worried about water and food. Merchants struggled to maintain trade, and tensions ran high. The widow stepped in once more, offering solutions that were both practical and fair. She guided travelers to hidden water sources, suggested ways for families to ration food, and helped merchants organize fair exchanges. Her calm leadership during this difficult time solidified her position in the town. People began to rely on her judgment, and even those who had once mocked or ignored her began to treat her with respect. The rancher's son, seeing the growing influence of the widow, attempted to undermine her quietly. He spread rumors about her, hoping to sow doubt. But the townspeople, who had now witnessed her fairness and intelligence repeatedly, ignored his attempts. Some quietly told him that his actions were unwise, while others refused to engage with him at all. The widow, for her part, continued her work, unaffected by his efforts. She understood that true respect could not be forced through threats or insults. It could only be earned through consistent fairness and wisdom. One day, a traveler arrived with news of a group of settlers moving through the plains. They had heard of the widow's guidance and sought her advice on safe routes and water sources. She met them outside town, offering directions, tips, and a small supply of provisions. The settlers left grateful and impressed, spreading the story further. Her reputation was no longer confined to her town. It was beginning to echo across the surrounding lands.
Back in town, the rancher's son found himself isolated.
Friends avoided his company. Traders refused to extend credit, and even his family's influence could not fully protect him from the consequences of his choices. He attempted to confront the widow again, thinking that fear or intimidation might work. But she remained calm, her demeanor steady and confident. She spoke firmly, yet kindly, setting clear boundaries without aggression. He left the encounter frustrated, realizing for the first time that he could not easily manipulate or control her. The widow's actions had now shifted the balance of respect in the town. People began to see her not only as someone who helped travelers or settled disputes, but as a figure whose wisdom and patience commanded attention. Her calm leadership contrasted sharply with the reckless arrogance of the rancher's son, highlighting the difference between true strength and the illusion of power. As the days passed, more townspeople sought her advice on matters ranging from trade disputes to daily survival. Her ability to remain fair, calm, and helpful in every situation earned her the trust of even those who had once doubted her. Families began consulting her before making major decisions. Travelers asked for her guidance, and merchants respected her judgment in all dealings. The rancher's son watched this quietly, realizing that his previous attempts to dominate through force and arrogance were failing. He grew increasingly aware of his diminishing influence, though he struggled to understand why. The widow's quiet strength and steady guidance had created a network of respect that he could not disrupt. Meanwhile, the widow continued to observe and plan. She knew that true change required both patience and action. Each small act of guidance, every piece of advice offered, and every interaction with townspeople or travelers was part of a larger strategy. She was preparing for a moment when her influence could create a lasting transformation in the town, not through revenge or violence, but through wisdom and leadership. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, the widow reflected on the weeks that had passed. She had transformed from someone overlooked and humiliated into a figure of quiet power and respect. Her patience, intelligence, and fairness had begun to reshape the town. She knew that challenges remained, but she was ready. Her strength no longer depended on fear or anger. It rested on the trust and admiration she had earned through her actions. The town continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the growing change. Merchants traded goods, travelers moved through the streets, and the rancher's son struggled to maintain his influence. But beneath the surface, the balance was shifting. The widow's reputation was spreading, and people began to whisper her name with a sense of respect and caution. Her influence was no longer limited to small acts. It was becoming a force that could shape the town and the surrounding lands. The widow understood that the future required careful planning and observation. She continued to gather information about trade routes, resources, and the movements of travelers and settlers. She helped those in need without seeking recognition, building trust and loyalty quietly. Each day she strengthened her network and prepared for the moment when her wisdom and influence could bring lasting change. The rancher's son, frustrated and increasingly aware of his diminishing control, made mistakes that revealed his arrogance and lack of understanding. He failed to see how the widow's steady presence had shifted the town's perception of him. His wealth and family name no longer shielded him from the consequences of his behavior. By the end of this part, the widow had established herself as a quiet but undeniable force in the town. People sought her guidance, travelers respected her knowledge, and even those who had once mocked her could not ignore her influence. The balance of power was slowly tilting, and the widow was prepared to take the next steps toward reshaping the town and confronting the consequences of past wrongs, not through violence, but through wisdom, patience, and steady leadership. As stars began to appear in the wide western sky, she looked out over the town and the surrounding plains. The road ahead remained challenging, with many obstacles yet to face, but she was ready. She had learned that true strength was not shown through anger or confrontation, but through calm, steady action, fairness, and intelligence. Her journey was far from over, and the town had no idea that the quiet Apache widow at the edge of the settlement was becoming a legend, one small action at a time. The town had begun to change in subtle ways that even the rancher's son could no longer ignore. People no longer laughed at his jokes or followed his commands without question. The quiet strength of the Apache widow had shifted the balance in ways he did not understand. He had tried to assert himself through money, influence, and arrogance, but every attempt only highlighted his recklessness. Meanwhile, the widow moved with calm purpose, guiding the town without confrontation, helping travelers and residents, and steadily growing the respect of those around her. One morning, news arrived that a small caravan of settlers was approaching the town. They had heard of the widow's wisdom and sought guidance for safe passage through the plains. Word traveled quickly, and by the time the settlers arrived, many in town were eager to see her. The widow stepped forward without hesitation. She listened carefully to the travelers' concerns, asked about their resources, and studied the routes they intended to take. Then, with quiet authority, she offered advice on where to find water, how to avoid rough terrain, and which supplies to ration carefully. The settlers followed her guidance, grateful for her insight, and the town watched as she helped people without seeking attention or reward. The rancher's son observed from the market square, growing frustrated and uneasy. His attempts to appear strong were no longer enough to dominate the town. People whispered to each other when he passed, and some openly ignored him. For the first time he realized that fear and wealth alone could not secure respect. The widow had something he could not buy or demand: trust earned steadily through actions and fairness. As the drought continued, the widow became more involved in helping the town survive. She helped organize a water distribution plan, ensuring that no family went without. She advised merchants on rationing food and goods, and she mediated conflicts between settlers who were struggling under the heat and scarcity. Her calm guidance and fairness created a sense of order in a time of chaos, and more people began to rely on her judgment. Even the town's elders, who had once been skeptical, recognized her leadership quietly and offered subtle support. Her reputation continued to grow, carried not by loud words but by steady actions. The rancher's son, feeling threatened, tried to regain control. He attempted to spread rumors, hoping to cast doubt on her abilities. But the townspeople, having witnessed her consistent fairness and wisdom, refused to believe his words. Some quietly advised him to reconsider his actions, while others simply ignored his attempts. His isolation grew, and his frustration deepened. Every mistake he made, every harsh word or thoughtless action, only strengthened the widow's position in the town. Her calm presence and steady judgment made him look foolish in comparison. One afternoon, the widow noticed a young boy struggling to lead a stubborn horse through the streets. The boy was frustrated and about to give up, but she stepped forward calmly. She guided him gently, showing how to gain the horse's trust rather than forcing it. The boy followed her instructions and managed to lead the horse successfully. Observers, including merchants and travelers, began to whisper about her patience and knowledge. These small acts were unnoticed by the rancher's son at first, but they accumulated into a pattern of influence he could not compete with. As her reputation spread, more travelers sought her guidance. Some brought news from distant towns, while others sought advice on survival, trade, or navigating the plains. She listened carefully, offered thoughtful guidance, and earned the trust of all who came to her. Her influence was no longer confined to the settlement. It was beginning to reach neighboring towns and outlying regions. The whispers about her wisdom and fairness spread, and her name began to carry weight beyond the town's dusty streets. The rancher's son grew increasingly desperate. He tried to challenge her authority directly, confronting her in the streets in front of witnesses. But the widow remained calm. She did not raise her voice, did not respond with anger, and did not act aggressively. Instead, she spoke clearly and firmly, setting boundaries and explaining the consequences of his behavior in a way that was fair and reasonable. People watched and listened, recognizing her strength. The young man's threats and arrogance seemed small and foolish in comparison. By standing calmly and wisely, she demonstrated the true measure of power. Soon, a trade dispute arose between two merchants in town. The rancher's son attempted to intervene, using his wealth to pressure one side. The widow stepped in quietly, listening to both merchants and understanding the facts. She suggested a solution that was fair, practical, and acceptable to both parties. The merchants followed her advice, and the conflict ended without further tension. The town noticed the contrast. The widow resolved issues calmly and effectively, while the rancher's son's attempts only created conflict and confusion. Her reputation as a wise and fair leader grew stronger with every challenge she helped resolve. Word of her abilities spread quickly. Travelers who had been helped by her carried stories to distant settlements. Families in the town shared their experiences of her fairness and guidance. People began seeking her advice before making decisions, trusting her judgment over that of the rancher's son or others who relied on wealth or intimidation. She had become a quiet leader, respected not because she demanded it but because she had earned it through consistent action. The young rancher's son, increasingly aware of his diminishing influence, grew reckless. He made mistakes in business, mismanaged resources, and alienated those who had once supported him. The townspeople, who had begun to rely on the widow's guidance, were no longer willing to follow him blindly. His wealth and family name offered no protection against the consequences of his own poor decisions. The widow observed all of this patiently, knowing that the natural outcome of his arrogance would soon become clear. One evening, as the sun set over the plains and painted the sky in shades of gold and red, the widow reflected on her journey. She had moved from a position of vulnerability and humiliation to one of influence and respect. Her strength did not come from violence or anger, but from patience, wisdom, and fairness. She had built trust, resolved conflicts, guided travelers, and strengthened the community through her actions. The town's perception of her had shifted completely. People no longer saw her as an outsider, but as someone whose presence mattered deeply. Even the rancher's son, despite his pride, began to realize that his attempts to dominate through fear, wealth, and arrogance were failing. He could not compete with the quiet strength and careful strategy of the widow. Her calm judgment and consistent fairness had created a network of respect that he could not break. His frustration grew, and he found himself increasingly isolated while her influence continued to expand. The widow also began preparing for the future. She studied the town's resources, observed the movements of travelers, and kept track of trade routes. She helped families and merchants in ways that strengthened the community, ensuring that the town could survive the hardships of the plains. Every action she took, no matter how small, built her reputation and her network of support. She understood that leadership required more than courage. It required wisdom, foresight, and patience. As the stars appeared in the sky and the town settled into quiet, she looked toward the horizon. The challenges of the future were still ahead, but she was ready. Her influence had grown steadily, her reputation was strong, and the balance of power in the town had shifted. People sought her advice, travelers trusted her guidance, and even the rancher's son began to recognize her strength, though he struggled to accept it. By the end of this period, the widow had reached a point where her quiet wisdom and fair actions had created a lasting change. She had transformed from someone vulnerable and humiliated into a respected leader whose influence extended beyond the town itself. Her patience, intelligence, and careful planning had reshaped the community, earning the trust and admiration of those around her. The town continued its daily rhythm, yet the undercurrent had changed. The settlers, travelers, merchants, and families all recognized that the widow's calm leadership had brought stability, fairness, and guidance during difficult times. The rancher's son, despite his attempts to assert control, had become a minor figure in comparison, a reminder that arrogance without wisdom could not stand. The Apache widow stood quietly at the edge of town that evening, observing the bustling streets, listening to the murmurs of people, and watching the horizon. She knew that challenges would continue to come, but she also knew that she had built a foundation of respect, trust, and influence that could withstand adversity. Her story was far from over. Yet she had proven that quiet strength, patience, and wisdom could change the course of events more effectively than anger or confrontation. Her journey was no longer about survival alone. It was about shaping the world around her through fairness, intelligence, and calm action. The town had begun to whisper her name with respect and admiration. She had become a quiet force whose presence mattered, and her influence was only growing. The Apache widow had moved from being underestimated to being a symbol of quiet power. Her reputation for fairness and wisdom was spreading across the frontier, carried by travelers, settlers, and townspeople alike. She had demonstrated that true strength was not about violence or dominance, but about patience, strategy, and consistent action. And as the night settled over the plains, she prepared for the next steps of her journey, ready to continue shaping the town and the lives of those around her, with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the power of resilience, wisdom, and calm leadership. The town had changed more than anyone could have imagined. Where once the streets echoed with laughter at the widow's expense, now they carried quiet respect. Her name had begun to spread beyond the settlement, whispered by travelers who had felt her guidance, and by townspeople who had witnessed her fairness. The Apache widow had become more than just a survivor. She had become a leader, a symbol of wisdom and calm strength in a harsh land. The rancher's son struggled to maintain what little influence he still had. Every action he took seemed to backfire. Merchants refused to extend favors without careful negotiation. Travelers ignored his boasts and sought guidance from her instead. Even some of his own friends began to quietly distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with his reckless behavior. He could no longer command attention through arrogance or wealth. The balance of power had shifted, and he felt it deeply, though he could not yet fully understand how or why. The widow, however, remained calm. She did not gloat, nor did she take pleasure in his decline. Instead, she focused on strengthening the community, helping those in need, and preparing for the challenges that the frontier still held. She understood that lasting change came not from anger or revenge, but from steady action, careful planning, and fairness that earned trust. Every decision she made, every act of guidance continued to build her reputation and influence. One day, a serious dispute arose over land claims. A group of ranchers argued fiercely, threatening to disrupt trade and create tension in the town. The rancher's son saw an opportunity to assert himself, hoping to regain respect by siding with the larger, more aggressive group. But the townspeople, who had come to trust the widow's judgment, looked to her for guidance instead. She listened carefully to all parties, assessed the situation with clear logic, and suggested a solution that balanced fairness with practicality. Her advice was accepted, the dispute resolved peacefully, and the town began to see her not only as a mediator, but as a true leader. The young rancher, frustrated and humiliated, realized that he had no authority here. His arrogance had lost him respect, while the widow's calm wisdom had won the town's trust. He tried to confront her privately, hoping to intimidate her into submission, but she met him with quiet confidence.
She spoke firmly yet gently, setting boundaries and explaining the consequences of his behavior in a way that left no room for argument. He left, knowing he could not overpower her with threats, money, or influence.
Her influence continued to grow as she helped both travelers and townspeople. Families sought her advice on trade, survival, and navigating the harsh plains. Travelers arriving from distant settlements asked her guidance before continuing their journeys. She advised merchants on how to manage scarce supplies during droughts, and taught young settlers skills that would help them survive and thrive. Her presence became a source of stability and hope, a reminder that wisdom, patience, and fairness could overcome fear and arrogance. The rancher's son, now isolated and increasingly desperate, made more mistakes. He mismanaged resources, angered merchants, and alienated the few allies he had left. The town, guided by the widow's influence, no longer turned to him for advice or favors. People spoke quietly among themselves about his reckless behavior, recognizing the contrast between his arrogance and her calm leadership. His decline was now clear, and he could do little to stop it. One afternoon, a group of settlers arrived carrying news of a distant drought that threatened several towns. They had heard of the widow's wisdom and guidance and asked for her advice on safe routes, water sources, and rationing supplies. She met with them outside the settlement, offering detailed instructions and small provisions to help them along the way. The settlers left grateful, and word of her guidance spread further across the plains. Her influence was no longer confined to her town, it was reaching the wider region. The widow also continued helping the town internally. She organized small gatherings where merchants and settlers could discuss challenges and share solutions. She mediated disputes fairly, offering practical and balanced advice. Families trusted her judgment, travelers sought her guidance, and even the town's elders who had once doubted her now respected her insight. Her calm, consistent actions had built a network of trust and influence that could withstand any challenge. The rancher's son, watching from the market square, realized that he had lost the town's respect. He could no longer dominate conversations, influence decisions, or intimidate anyone. Every attempt he made to assert himself only highlighted his arrogance and lack of judgment. The townspeople quietly ignored him or, in some cases, openly refused to follow his lead. The widow, however, continued her work, unaffected by his frustration. Her focus remained on the town's well-being, not on punishing him. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and cast long shadows across the town, the widow reflected on her journey. She had begun as someone isolated and humiliated, and now she had become a trusted leader whose influence reached beyond the town. Her patience, fairness, and intelligence had transformed the way people thought, acted, and treated one another. She had created stability in a place of uncertainty, guided travelers safely through the plains, and earned the respect of all who knew her. The town itself had changed as well. Where fear and arrogance once ruled, wisdom and fairness now guided decisions. People consulted her before making major choices. Travelers followed her advice, and families relied on her judgment. Her leadership was not loud or aggressive, but it was powerful. The contrast between her calm authority and the rancher's son's reckless behavior made her influence undeniable. The young rancher, facing the full consequences of his mistakes, tried one last time to assert control. He confronted a group of merchants, attempting to use threats and wealth to gain advantage. But the widow had already guided the merchants on fair practices, and they refused to be intimidated. The town watched as his efforts failed once more, and the whispers of her name grew louder, now carrying not only respect, but admiration. As the days passed, more travelers and settlers came seeking her guidance. She advised them on safe routes, water sources, trade opportunities, and survival strategies. Her influence spread naturally, quietly, and effectively. People began to speak of her as someone who could guide them through both danger and opportunity, a leader whose judgment was fair and whose actions were consistent. The rancher's son, increasingly aware of his diminishing power, finally accepted that he could not compete with her influence. He had tried arrogance, wealth, threats, and manipulation, but none of it could match the respect she had earned through patience, fairness, and wisdom. His pride suffered, but he could do nothing to reverse the tide. The widow had become the true guiding force in the town. One afternoon she helped a group of children who had wandered into the hills. She showed them how to find water, recognize safe paths, and understand the land. The townspeople watched as the children learned from her, realizing that her influence extended to the next generation. Her guidance was shaping not only the present but the future of the town and surrounding areas. The settlers who had once laughed at her or ignored her now sought her advice and respected her decisions. Traders consulted her before extending credit or selling goods. Travelers trusted her knowledge of the plains. Families depended on her judgment in times of scarcity. The town had fully embraced her influence, and the rancher's son had become a minor figure, remembered only for his arrogance and the lessons it had taught others about true strength. By the end of this period, the Apache widow had fully transformed her life. She had taken what had once been humiliation and turned it into a source of strength. Her patience, intelligence, and fairness had reshaped the town and earned the respect of all who lived there. She had built a network of trust and influence that extended beyond the settlement itself, reaching neighboring regions and travelers passing through. Her reputation had become legendary, carried in whispers and stories from town to town. People spoke of the woman who had turned humiliation into wisdom, who had guided travelers safely, and who had earned respect through consistent, fair actions. The rancher's son's arrogance had faded in comparison, leaving him as a reminder that wealth and force alone could never overcome quiet strength, wisdom, and patience. As night fell and stars appeared in the wide western sky, the widow stood at the edge of the town, looking over the plains. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from isolation and humiliation to influence and respect. She knew that challenges would continue to come, but she was ready. She had learned that true strength came not from violence or confrontation, but from fairness, wisdom, and steady action. The town had learned this lesson as well. People now whispered her name not with fear, but with respect. They understood that she had earned her place through patience, guidance, and the ability to help others. Her story would be remembered and told to travelers, settlers, and the next generation of the town's children. She had transformed not only her own life, but the community around her, leaving a lasting legacy of strength, wisdom, and fairness. The Apache widow had achieved her triumph. She had turned the cruelty of one man into a lesson for all, showing that patience, intelligence, and fair action could overcome arrogance and fear. Her influence was permanent, her respect undeniable, and her story one that would be told for generations. She had become a symbol of resilience, quiet power, and the lasting impact of wisdom, guided by fairness. And as the wind moved across the plains, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant hills, she knew that her journey had created something stronger than she could have imagined. A town led not by fear, but by the quiet, steady strength of a woman who had refused to be defeated.